Hey, you want to add textures to your product in a way that they wrap and display properly around your 3D object. We'll dissect, demonstrate, and simplify the UV and texture wrapping techniques needed to do this. I'll also show you how to wrap flat textures on warped or curved faces and how to combine manual and automatic UV unwrapping techniques. We'll learn all this in this video. To apply a texture to an object properly in 3D, you first need to do something very important, and it's called UV unwrapping. For some artists, this typically sounds too technical, but I promise you that once you grab the logic, you'll be texturing anything. So what is UV unwrapping? UV unwrapping is simply translating your 3D mesh into a flat 2D representation or map, so that you can place a texture on it that will now wrap properly around the 3D object. Let's simplify this with a simple visual demonstration. Here's a box in 3D. In reality, if you were to make this product flat, you'll have to tear these edges at this point for it to be flat. You then unwrap it, print or place your texture or design on it. Then you wrap or fold it back into its 3D form, and it will now have the textures in the right place. This simply explains UV unwrapping. If we also consider a cylindrical object, we will need to cut it at one end like this. Then we unwrap it, place our design, and when it wraps back, we will have the textures in place. Now that is the logic. But of course, when doing this in your 3D software, you have a dedicated UV space. So it's not like you are unwrapping the actual 3D object, then wrapping it back. It unwraps in the UV space, which is a 2D viewport. Let's quickly practicalize the box demonstration in Blender. First, let's shape this box to look similar. So I'll just scale it on the Z axis. Then I'll go to the UV layout. Here we have the UV space, also called the 1x1 space. And here on the right, we have the 3D viewport. This cross shape you are seeing in the UV space is there because Blender unwraps a cube by default. But since we have now changed the shape of the cube, it means we can't use this. So I'll reset it by selecting all the faces. I'll hit U on my keyboard, and then I'll select reset. Also, because we changed the shape of the cube, we need to apply the transformations. So go to the object mode, select the object, and hit Ctrl A, then select all transforms. Now we can go back to the edit mode. So to make cuts on this box, we just simply select edges and mark them as seams. But please note that there is no rule for how to select, cut, or make your seams. You do this based on what works best for the object you are trying to unwrap and for the texture to be placed seamlessly. So let's select or cut the edges just as we did in the demonstration. So I'll select the edges. Then I'll right click and I'll select Mark Seam over here. After this, I'll go to the face mode. I'll hit A to select all the faces, then I'll hit U, then select Unwrap. As you can see in the UV space, this has unwrapped just like we had in the demonstration. Now for our main practical, we'll be unwrapping this entire bottle and adding a texture to the central area. But hey, I would love it if you subscribe to my channel. I have loads of lessons, tips, and hacks to share. I'll also be releasing free and detailed 3D assets with manuals on how to use them. So kindly subscribe. And also, before I forget, I will drop the products I use in this tutorial in my 3D community on Telegram. So you can join us there using the link in the description below. You'll also get more assistance, guides, and tips that will help you grow. So now let's unwrap and texture this product. Go over to the UV editing tab. Now, if you don't want to go through the stress of cutting your UV manually, you can just select the entire mesh in the face mode, hit U, and click Smart UV Project. The system will automatically create seam lines and unwrap your UVs for you. But the disadvantage here is that it will most likely not place the seams in places that are favorable for your texture, and most times it adds more seams than what is needed. This method is actually useful when you have too many objects in your scene that you may not zoom in too closely, but you want them to have textures. You can project them automatically and prioritize the ones in focus. But if you want to unwrap your UVs manually and properly, first take note of these three things. Number one, cuts and seams are made simply by selecting the edges on the mesh and marking them as seams. We already mentioned that before. Number two, when deciding on where to add your seam lines, make sure it's at a part that's not really visible to the camera, as the textures typically discontinue from the seam line except it's a seamless texture. This is an example of a seamless texture, and this is an example of a texture that breaks. Number three, the UV island. Now, the UV island is simply a portion of the UV that has been detached from the others. To create a UV island, you have to make a loop selection, and that's the selection that connects from point A back to point A. The way to do this on Blender is to hold Shift and Alt, then left click on a particular edge. It will select that loop if there's a loop to select there. A loop selection could also be a selection that starts from point A and is discontinued at any point, which marks the end of that loop. A UV island can also be created within an enclosed selection. So that's where different selections intersect and there is no breaking point, just like this. So let's get to work. We need to create a checkerboard image texture and apply it on the mesh. This is the best way to preview the way the UVs are going to be projected on the mesh. So go to Image in the UV Editing tab, hit New, and under the Generated type, select UV Grid. Then go to the Material tab, create a new material. Under the base color, select Image Texture. Then click here to select the grid we just created. After this, switch to your material preview mode by hitting Z on your keyboard, then selecting material preview. The goal is to always have the boxes on the checkerboard to be as even as possible around the area you want to apply your texture. This will ensure that it's not stretched. So to start creating seams for this bottle, I'll first mark out an island to isolate the area where we'll be applying our texture. Remember, we'll do that by simply creating a loop. So switch back to the solid mode for better preview, hit Z on your keyboard, and then select solid. Then we can make the first loop selection here by holding Shift and Alt on your keyboard and then selecting around this area. Then right click and select Mark Seam. As it is currently, let's interpret how our UVs will turn out. In the face mode, hit A to select all the polygons and then hit U and select Unwrap. As you can see, these two areas have been detached as separate islands, even if they are not unwrapped properly. To help you work better, let's do a quick navigation lesson on the UV space. You can select and view your UVs in different ways. First, you can use all the modes up here. Use this to select the points of your UV. This to select the edges of your UV. This to select the faces of your UV. And this to select the UV islands. And your UVs are displayed when you select all faces on your mesh by hitting A in the edit face mode. But if you want to sync your edit mode with your UV space so that your UVs display alongside your mesh in the edit mode, just click this sync icon over here. So now as you select your mesh or UVs, you can see the areas that are being selected with the entire mesh and UV still in place. This mode in particular doesn't have the option to select an island, but you can make selections the same way you make them in the edit mode. Also, the checkerboard texture we created earlier is important for you to see how balanced or distorted your textures will be with the current UVs you have. So if I switch to the material preview mode by holding Z on my keyboard, you can see how the checkerboard is distorted with the current UVs we have. This means that we have still not unwrapped or relaxed this mesh properly. So let's go on to add another loop at this area to isolate the area we want to brand. Then I'll mark the seam. So now, if we unwrap this as it is, it means we'll have 3 islands. And most importantly, we have separated an island for the area we want to brand. You can hide and isolate faces by hitting Shift H on your keyboard. If you're not adding textures to the other areas, then you can prioritize only the relevant area. Currently, these UVs have not unwrapped properly because they don't have a tear or cut to make it spread out. It's like trying to take the shape as it is, then flattening it out without tearing it on the sides. To make the UVs tear properly, I'll select one vertical line at the back of the product. So the different islands will have a point to tear from and relax properly. I'll also add additional loops at the top and bottom like this. So what we expect after we unwrap this is 5 UV islands. Here, 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 and here. So now let's right click and mark the newly selected edges as seams. Then in the face mode, hit A to select all the faces, then hit U and then unwrap. So these are the different islands we have now. This is the island we are interested in. So let's move and position it using G and R. I'll move it to the top and rearrange the others. I'll also use S to scale it to fit properly. The next thing to do is to ensure that your UV island is facing the right direction. To do this, you can either wait to apply a texture then adjust the UV accordingly, or you can first click this icon to sync your UV and edit mode. The objective here is to use the 3D object to direct the angle that the UV would face. For instance, this face here is at the beginning of the mesh based on where we placed our seam or cut. That means the corresponding face on the UV should be at the top left corner. But now if you look at its position in the UV space, it's at the bottom left corner. So that means we just have to mirror it on the y-axis. So select the entire UV island, right click and select mirror Y. If you click around, you'll see that the UV is in sync with your mesh. And that's it, the UV is ready. Now let's go on to texturing. I'll show you 2 ways you can apply textures to your mesh. The first will be to add a new material, then change the base color to image texture, click open, then select the texture. Make sure the texture you are adding is in a proportion similar to the relevant area on your mesh. After this, isolate the faces on the relevant UV island by hitting Shift H on your keyboard. So with the faces selected, go back to the Material tab. You can rename the new material you created. So after renaming it, just hit Assign. Then we can switch to our material preview mode to see what we have. So here you have the checkerboard texture we created before on the other areas of the product, and the new material has only been assigned to the selected faces. So to adjust the UV to fit the new texture, in the UV space, go over here and select the new texture we just added. The UVs may appear distorted after doing this, but with the UV island still selected, just hit U and unwrap it again. Then now you can position it properly using G to move, R to rotate, and S to scale. If you look at the texture on the product and it's not facing the right angle, here the problem is that it's mirrored on the x-axis. So with the UV selected, simply right click and mirror it on the x-axis. Then you can scale and move it into position. And that's it for the first technique. Now the second way to apply your texture that I'll show you is to export this current UV layout as an image so we can place the texture in the exact position. This method requires basic knowledge of Photoshop or Illustrator or any other graphic software. So to do this, go to the UV menu, then select Export UV Layout. Save the image where you want to put it. Then you can go to your graphic software. I'll use Photoshop. So in Photoshop, try to position your texture to match the unwrapped UV island. After this, you can increase the resolution or leave it as it is, but still ensure it's in the 1:1 aspect ratio. Then save the new image and go back to Blender. Next, create an image texture with your design, but this time it can work with the material assigned to the entire object, or it can still work using the first technique. So we can either create a new material, load the edited image texture, then with all the faces of the product selected, you can hit Assign. Or we can also isolate the relevant faces and with the material selected, hit assign. It will appear perfectly in that position, and as you can see, the other checkerboard texture is still showing. So preferably, just assign the texture to the relevant faces. And that's it for the second technique. So let's address an elephant in the room. What if you wanted to apply a label texture to this area, but it's UV, it's not flattened out for you to do that properly? Is there a way that we can make it flat that still makes it wrap properly? Yes, there's a way. Firstly, note that as it is, it has unwrapped following the shape of the object. It can work for other textures like scratches, wood, metal, and others, but it may not work perfectly for you to add a label texture. So how do we do this? The simple trick is to straighten out a particular face on the UV island, then use that as a reference to straighten the others out. So make sure you are in the edge mode first. Then select this edge. To straighten it out, hit S, X, then 0. It will straighten that edge on the x-axis. When you are hitting the combination of keys, make sure you don't press anything in between. Select the next edge, hit S, Y, and 0. Next, also hit S, Y, then 0. Then for this, it will be S, X, then 0. So now we have this looking like a proper rectangle. Next, go to the face mode, select the face that has the rectangle, then hit L on your keyboard to link the selection to the others. After this, just right click, then select follow active chords. And that's it. So let's isolate this island using Shift H, then I'll assign the label material to it. Now, all we have to do is just to adjust and move the UV island to where the texture is. So I'll move this around for you to see how it can wrap around the object. And you can see that it's now placed properly on the mesh. So let's take this back as we're not concerned with this area. But just show that in case that's what you want to do in your project and so you don't get stuck. But if you want to create a material for the other parts of the project, maybe you want to render this out, you can either edit the checkerboard material and change it to what you want, or you can create a new material, select the other faces and leave out the central area, then assign the material to the other faces. So this way, you have control over both materials and you can control the look also separately. So this is what we'll have. Now to simplify this when you want to work on another product, you can simply create a seam to just isolate the areas that need texturing. Also note that if your intended material is plain or without any scratch or texture, you may not actually need to unwrap your UVs to complete your project. But as I promised earlier, I'll quickly show you how to unwrap this object or this product using the manual and automatic methods in the same UV layout. So what we can do is to isolate the important area, unwrap it, and then for the other areas, we'll use the Smart UV project. So I'll create a seam around this area. Remember, for it to detach as an island of its own, it has to connect as a loop. So I'll select this and mark it as a seam. This island doesn't need any extra chords to be flattened out, as the shape is already like a plane, so all it needs is just to be unwrapped. In the face mode, hit U, then unwrap. You see that we have the main areas flattened out properly, and then we have the other island just compressed. So for the other parts, let's use the Smart UV project. So select the other UV island, hit U, and then select Smart UV project. After this, you see that this will cut your UV automatically and place seam lines automatically in different areas and different corners. So what's left for you to do is just to arrange this properly, prioritizing the main and important area. So I'll arrange it this way. Then when you're done with this, you can follow any of the previous steps we took to texture this product. I would actually love to see how you texture this product. So you can find the product in my 3D community. The link is attached in the description below. Also, if you want to learn how to make this product and also how to render this product and also how to add materials to this product, on this channel I've done a product series on a fresh start in 3D modeling. So you can go through the extensive and exciting journey to learn how to model products properly and also how to utilize other modeling techniques on your product. And I also taught basic animation, basic material creation, basic lighting, and basic rendering. So you definitely want to check this series out. And don't forget to subscribe for more amazing CG tutorials and to also have access to my free and detailed 3D assets. Bye for now.